This video probably won't give you a lot, but I wanted to do this type of video since I like history. Beforehand, I wanted to give a brief explanation of what it's going to be. This is kind of like an introduction to my upcoming playthrough of the kaiserredux submod for Hearts of Iron 4, which the first part will be uploaded 2 days after this. I love history, so this is basically to give historical context as a way for both me and you viewing this to learn about the people in the playthrough I did in New England. I originally was going to write about multiple people present in that route, but I wrote way more about one person than I expected to. Anyway, on with the historical context of the person I made the leader in that playthrough, H.P. Lovecraft. But a brief warning before listening further. He was a morally terrible person, as he was a racist, so if that's something you don't want to hear about, now would be the time to click off of this video. Before going to H.P. Lovecraft's life story, I wanted to briefly talk about his beliefs. He was originally what's called a Tory, which is someone whose political philosophy is based on a British version of traditionalism and conservatism. This is probably due to his conservative upbringing, as his whole family supported the Republican Party. He voted for Herbert Hoover in 1928, but he was an Anglophile who supported the British monarchy. He was against democracy and believed the USA should be an aristocracy. Then when the Great Depression happened, he thought the USA would shift towards an aristocracy, but when it didn't happen, he became a socialist. He initially expressed support for Hitler, but thought his racial policy should be based on culture instead of descent. However, towards the end of his life, he opposed Hitler after one of his neighbors witnessed Jews being beaten in Germany and told Lovecraft about it. Religion-wise, he was an atheist, but originally was raised Protestant, so that's what his parents were. Now here's where we get into where Lovecraft was a terrible person. He didn't hold any race in high regard, except white people of English descent, like himself. People probably know the name of his cat, but I can't, and I won't say the name of it, but it ties into him being racist as part of it was a racial slur. Howard Phillips Lovecraft, or more commonly known as H.P. Lovecraft, was born August 20th, 1890 at his family home in Providence, Rhode Island. He was the only child of his parents Winfield Scott Lovecraft and Sarah Susan Lovecraft, also called Susie. His mom's family was of substantial means, as her dad Whipple Van Buren Phillips was involved in business ventures. In April of 1893, Winfield had a psychotic episode in a Chicago hotel and was committed to Butler Hospital in Providence. His medical records indicated he was doing and saying strange things for a year before this happened. He was in there for 5 years before he died from late-stage syphilis in 1898. The Lovecraft said his dad fell into a paralytic state due to being overworked and having insomnia. He could have just been kept ignorant of his father's illness, or he was being misleading on purpose. After the death of his father, he lived with his mom, her sisters Lillian and Annie, and her parents Whipple and Ruby. Susie would pamper Lovecraft and not let him out of her sight. Later, Lovecraft said she was stricken with grief after his dad's illness. Whipple became Lovecraft's father figure, and in Lovecraft's words became the center of my entire universe. Lovecraft was proficient at reading and writing by the age of 3, so when his grandfather was away on business, they wrote letters to each other. His grandfather was one who encouraged Lovecraft to appreciate literature, like classical literature and English poetry. He helped raise Lovecraft and educated him on the classics of literature, but also told him original weird tales of winged horrors and deep, low, moaning sounds to entertain his grandson. The sources for these tales are unknown, but Lovecraft believed they came from Gothic novelists like Anne Radcliffe, Matthew Lewis, and Charles Maturin. This is where Lovecraft was introduced to his earliest influences like The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and 1001 Nights. In 1896, when his grandmother Ruby died, it had a great effect on his family. He said it sent him into a gloom from which it never fully recovered. The black mourning dresses that his mother and aunts wore terrified him and led to him having the recurring nightmares, or what he called night gaunts, that inspired his later writings. The earliest known of Lovecraft's writings were made when he was 7. They were poems restyling mythological stories like the Odyssey. He said he was enamored with the Roman gods and seen them as genuine expressions of divinity, to the point of foregoing his Christian upbringing. At 5, when he was told Santa wasn't real, he responded by asking, "God is not equally a myth?" Then when he was 8, he became more interested in sciences, more specifically in astronomy and chemistry. He also read an anatomy book and stated it virtually killed his interest in the subject of human reproduction. In 1902, in one of his letters, he said astronomy was a guiding influence on how he viewed the world. He eventually began producing a periodical called the Rhode Island Journal of Astronomy, of which 69 issues still survive. During this time, he also went in and out of elementary school repeatedly for health concerns that aren't clear, with him having home tutors to make up for it. His peers described Lovecraft as being withdrawn but also welcoming to anyone who was also fascinated in astronomy or would invite him to look through his telescope. By 1900, Whipple's various businesses started to suffer a downturn which tried to reduce his family's wealth slowly. The hired servants were let go, leaving just Whipple, Susie, and Lovecraft alone in the house. And in the spring of 1904, Whipple's largest business venture went through a catastrophic failure. Within months of that, he died of a stroke when he was 70. Susie couldn't support the upkeep on the estate, so she moved herself and her son to a small duplex later that year. Lovecraft referred to this time as one of the darkest of his life, and that he didn't see a reason to live anymore, to the point that he considered committing suicide. He didn't end up doing so because his scientific curiosity and desire to know more about the world prevented it. In the fall of that same year, he started high school, still being removed for long periods for what he called near breakdowns. He did have some conflicts with teachers, but still enjoyed school and even made a small circle of friends while performing well academically, especially in chemistry and physics. Besides the pause in 1904, he started publishing his periodical again and also started publishing the Scientific Gazette, which was mostly about chemistry. He also started producing the type of works he would be known for later, namely The Alchemist and The Beast in the Cave. Then in 1908 he suffered a health crisis prior to his high school graduation, this one being more severe than any before, though it's unknown what caused it, but he later called it a nervous collapse because of stress from school even though he enjoyed school. He said he had intense headaches, insomnia, and general nervous weakness. He was going to go to Brown University, but he never graduated high school and never attended school again. Lovecraft was described as having terrible tics where he'd be sitting and suddenly up and jump. There is a theory now that what caused this was chorea minor. His 1908 breakdown was attributed to a hysteroid seizure, which now is a term that usually denotes atypical depression. Lovecraft himself said that at that time he couldn't bear to see or speak to anyone, or he shut out the world by closing the shades and using artificial light. From 1908 to 1913, a lot of what Lovecraft and Susie did is unknown. Their wealth still declined, with the business failure of his uncle costing a large portion of their remaining wealth. Clara Hess, Susie's friend, later said that at one visit she talked about Lovecraft being so hideous that he hid from everyone and didn't like to walk on the streets where people would see him. Then as for Lovecraft, he called his mother a positive marvel of consideration. One of their neighbors thought that they had loud quarrels at night, but it was them reciting Shakespeare together, which they both enjoyed doing. He started his scientific periodicals again, committing himself to the study of organic chemistry, though his studies were hobbled by math, which he found boring and caused him headaches that would incapacitate him for a day. Lovecraft also had his first not-self-published poem appear in a local newspaper in 1912. This poem was called Providence in 2000 AD. He also wrote racist poetry at this time. As I said earlier, he wasn't a morally good person. In 1911, his letters to editors started appearing in pulp and weird fiction magazines such as Argosy. And in 1913, he wrote a critical letter to Fred Jackson, which was one of the prominent writers for Argosy. This letter called Jackson's stories trivial, effeminate, and, in places, coarse, which basically started a year-long feud between the two, along with some of Lovecraft's occasional supporters, and a majority of the readers that were critical of Lovecraft's view of Jackson. Lovecraft's biggest critic at the time was John Russell, who would reply in verse, and Lovecraft was compelled to respond because he respected his writing. Both Lovecraft and Russell were noticed by Edward F. Doss, the head editor of the United Amateur Press Association, the UAPA. He invited them both to the organization and they accepted, with Lovecraft joining in April 1914. Lovecraft was immersed in the world of amateur journalism for most of the following decade. He became chairman of the Department of Public Criticism for the UAPA in late 1914. He used this position to advocate for his insistence on the superiority of English language usage that others called archaic. He had Anglophile opinions most of his life and criticized other UAPA contributors for their Americanisms and slang, though he often used xenophobic and racist arguments in these criticisms. Then, in mid-1915, he was elected the first vice president of the UAPA, and 2 years afterwards he was elected president. He would appoint board members that shared his view of the supremacy of classical English. When World War I started, he wrote many criticisms about the reluctance of both the U.S. government and the American public to help Britain, which he viewed as America's homeland. Lovecraft published The Alchemist in the UAPA Journal in 1916, and W. Paul Cook, who would become his future lifelong friend, encouraged Lovecraft to write and publish more fiction. This is when the Tomb and Dagon were written and published. Dagon is considered his first work that embraced the concepts and themes his writing became known for. In 1918, he was no longer president of the UAPA and went back to his former chairman office. Also, in 1917, he made an aborted attempt to join the army, because his mother threatened to go to any length legal or otherwise, if he didn't reveal his ailments that made him unfit for the army. He then tried to enlist in the Rhode Island National Guard, but couldn't because of medical reasons. In the winter of 1918 to 1919, Susie had shown symptoms of a nervous breakdown and went to live with her sister Lillian. In March 1919, she was committed to Butler Hospital. This hit Lovecraft hard, to the point of him saying existence seems of little value, and that he wished it might terminate. He would visit her periodically and walk the grounds with her. During late 1919, he became more outgoing, like going with friends to writer gatherings. In early 1920, he met Frank Belknap Long, who became his most influential and closest confidant for the rest of his life. This period was most prolific of Lovecraft's short story career, that was later called Lovecraft's Dream Cycle, and later in 1920 he began publishing stories that fit with his Cthulhu mythos, which was a term most likely coined by August Derleth. This is where one of his most enduring bits of his writing was made, which was the quote, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die." On May 24, 1921, Susie died in the Butler Hospital from complications of a gallbladder surgery she had 5 days earlier. Lovecraft went into an extreme nervous shock that crippled her physically and emotionally, causing him again to say he had no reason to continue living. He still went to amateur journalist conventions and eventually met Sonia Green in July. Even though his aunts disapproved of the relationship, they were married on March 3, 1924, and went to live at her apartment in Brooklyn. His weight increased to 200 pounds on his wife's home cooking. He became enthralled by New York, and in something called the Kalem Club, he acquired a group of encouraging literary friends that urged him to submit stories to the magazine Weird Tales. Though not long after they were married, she lost her business and her assets disappeared in a bank failure, and she also became ill. Lovecraft tried to support her through regular jobs, but since he didn't have previous experience, he lacked marketable skills. So after a few unsuccessful jobs, the search became desultory. Sonia eventually moved to Cincinnati, then Cleveland on New Year's Day of 1925. Since her new job required travel, and Lovecraft moved to Red Hook, which was an area that came to discomfort him greatly. His house was eventually burgled, leaving him with only the clothes on his back. Around the time he wrote the outline for the Call of the Cthulhu, he moved to Brooklyn Heights, and lost about 40 pounds by the time he left for Providence in 1926. In Providence he lived in a Victorian wooden house until 1933, and the period that began after his return to Providence, the last decade of his life, was his most prolific. He wrote short stories along with his longest works of fiction. He also did ghost writing, and one of his clients, Harry Houdini, tried to help Lovecraft by introducing him to the head of a newspaper syndicate. Though plans for a further project ended when Houdini died. The Dunwich Horror proved successful, but his other works brought him no remuneration. Lovecraft was extremely sensitive to criticism and would give up selling a story if it was rejected once. Also, for stories like The Shadow over Innsmouth, he didn't try to sell it and even ignored publishers that were interested. A few years after he moved to Providence, they lived separately for so long, he and Sonia agreed to an amicable divorce. She moved to California in 1933 and remarried in 1936. She wasn't aware that Lovecraft, even though he assured her otherwise, had never officially signed the final decree. His writings couldn't provide for his basic expenses, so he lived frugally on his nearly depleted inheritance. There were times he went without food to pay for mailing out letters. After he left New York, he moved to an apartment with his surviving aunt, Annie, though they eventually moved to a slightly cheaper place. Because of the Great Depression, he shifted towards socialism and started decrying his prior beliefs along with fascism. He supported Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but he didn't think the New Deal was sufficiently leftist. In late 1936, The Shadow over Innsmouth was published as a paperback book, but he was displeased as it was riddled with errors. It sold slowly and only about 200 copies of it were bound, with the remaining copies being destroyed when the publisher went out of business. At this point, his literary career came to an end, with his last short story being The Haunter of the Dark. He stated that the hostile reception of At the Mountains of Madness had done more than anything to end my effective fictional career. On June 11th, Robert E. Howard committed suicide when he was told his mother wouldn't wake up from her coma. After his suicide, she died shortly after. This deeply affected Lovecraft, who consoled his father, then almost immediately wrote a memoir titled In Memoriam, Robert Irvin Howard. Though in the meantime his own physical health was deteriorating from an affliction he called grippe. Since he had a fear of doctors, he didn't get examined until a month before his death. When he did see a doctor, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer of the small intestine. He was hospitalized and living in constant pain until he died on March 15, 1937 in Providence. In accordance with his lifelong scientific curiosity, he kept a diary about his illness until he was physically incapable of holding a pen. His name was listed on the Phillips family monument along with his parents. Though in 1977, fans of his erected a headstone in Swan Point Cemetery, on which they inscribed his name, the dates he was born and died, along with the phrase, "I am Providence."